The road ran tape measure straight for 60 kilometers. On either side spread low, grassy plains, marked here and there by a small farm or a truck, or a garden. The wind blew with a fierce pleasure, whipping the sheets on the clotheslines and electrifying the back of the hair of the children who played on the patchy dirt of the yards. It was hot. The sky was a blazing blue. They rode with the windows open. The radio was either too low or too loud. It buzzed and lilted with static urgency. Gina watched Pablo's profile as he drove, as he tapped the wheel. It was the face she remembered, but not as she remembered it. Maybe the background changed it, or maybe it was something archer, more ironic around the mouth. His forelock drooped and whipped as he sang along. Ben bumped his seat against the back of her seat, bumped his knees against the back of her seat. "Move it up a bit," he shouted. "You're jamming me." Gina bent forward and struggled with the lever under the seat. "You could have sat here, you know, I offered." They were halfway to Punta Esplanade, the beach house of Pablo's family, the old retreat where they spent summer weekends or cooled their heads when things got tangled. Ben had invited himself along at the last minute, sick of Montevideo, he said, and crammed his guitar case into the trunk along with a couple of liters of wine and a bag of chips. If it bothered Pablo, he didn't say. He just grinned a little at Gina and shrugged. Flaco. That's what they called Ben. Mostly for his fleshiness, his slope-shouldered ambling walk, the way he ate everything by the handful. He was 15 years older than Pablo, a half-brother, really half American, half crazy. Gina didn't mind his company so much, but she'd rather it had been just her and Pablo. She reached into her bag and felt around for the last pack of cigarettes. "Punchito?" Pablo said. He reached across his shoulder, pulled one out, and gingerly wedged it behind his ear. Ben poked the back of her seat again. She handed over the whole pack. The car was old enough to still have a lighter on the dashboard. It clicked as she pressed it, then emitted a thin little whine. A year ago, Pablo had slipped into her Northern California high school out of nowhere. He wasn't like the other foreign exchange students who were introduced around, shown the sights. He was just there one day, not talking in class. He sat with his legs straight in front of him, his old school skate shoes half untied. With his head down, he drew, filled whole pages with tiny figures, clothed and naked with pitchforks and sheep horns, scowling gargoyles leaping mid-air, or with their faces smashed into the margins, each one complete with an exquisite stamp. Other times he drew robots or trombones, fat babies, gnarled leprechauns, rockets. The teacher was a furry old man, coughing, set to die from cancer the next year. When he called out on Pablo, his tone was weary. Pablo would glance up, as if in surprise, then, with compliant deliberation, flip open his math book, and with studied nonchalance, angle his noble profile toward the clock. His nose had a bump, something Italian about it. A little mole, like a chocolate chip on his right cheekbone, pierced Gina's heart like an endearment. His elbows, poking out of his faded t-shirt, were cracked and pointed like a little boy's. She had a crush on him for months. Looked for him at lunch, learned to recognize his backpack. She wasn't sure what drew her to him. Maybe because he was so unlike the locals. I mean, even his slacking seemed refined. His smile crooked and shy, his resignation charming. And his body, not big and overdeveloped like the goofs who always wanted to date her. It reminded her of Donatello's David, the one where he stood with his hands on his hips and Goliath's head in a heap at his feet. She imagined herself riding on a moped with her arms around his waist, drinking beer with him, laughing under festive strings of light on a moonless summer evening. After a while, he was just there with her friends and the others, speaking in his soft English, laughing, giving in. She began to see him at parties. He'd noticed her at one, waved her over, and gotten her a beer. They'd shouted together for a few minutes, his head bent to hear her, his half smiles acknowledging. Then they walked outside behind the dark, pulsing house and into the field behind, uphill to the eucalyptus grove where it smelled of camphor. It was late spring, April. Hard buttons pushed into the soles of their shoes. He looked at her. His expression was both a scowl of concentration and an invitation. The silver, sickle-shaped leaves lay beneath them in an aromatic carpet. It was the smell she always associated with their beginning. "Look!" Pablo reached across the gear shift and touched her arm. "Over there!" Just off the roadside, almost like a large insect, an armadillo nosed its way from the ditch and emerged to stand in bewilderment at the edge of the pavement. It stood without moving, its small eyes retreating into its skull, the long nose at the ground as if to vacuum a grain or two of sand. In its plates of perfect armor, it looked unreal, like a little cubist painting transported onto the landscape. Pablo laughed and veered cheerfully towards it. For a second, Gina was confused. Was that Pablo now, crowing startlingly in Spanish? As they approached the armadillo, his voice rose and settled into a kind of rhythm, a machine gun succession of words that Gina understood only partially. Ben followed with a loud epithet that Gina guessed to be a punchline. She had 3 years of high school Spanish, but of course her Spanish only went so far. Not far at all, really, a couple of inches. When she was with Pablo and Ben, they spoke in English, American slanglish. But sometimes the two of them just would jerk away into their own patois, forgetting that Gina was there. Their voices just sounds, air, moving, fresh as wind, headed somewhere else. The car hit the shoulder with a grinding noise and sent a little cloud of dust up. Gina closed her eyes, feeling something inside her lurch. "No worries," Pablo grinned. "I just missed him." She frowned, took a drag of her cigarette and stepped it out. "How far is it?" she asked. "I have to go." "No time, princesa," Ben was stretching. "We have to turn back. I forgot the key in my other pants, the tight ones." 20 kilometers, Pablo said. "Let's stop, we need to get some beer anyway." He forgot the key, really? No, he's playing. Let's get 6 bottles at least. It's a little boring there. Sorry, lost my place. "You'll love me in my tight pants," Ben said. "You'll just love them." "She'll hate them," Pablo said. "She'll think you look like a chanchito." Wait, Ben paused abruptly, lifting his head in a signal to hold off. He seemed to be listening through the static. Then, quietly, in a sweet, unforced tenor, he began to sing along to the radio. He was rapt, performing his expression bland and his mouth a little slack. "Oft I sing for my friends, when death's cold hands I can see. Oh, when I reach to my journey's end, will this sing one song for me?" He closed his eyes and crooned. Through the verses, his spiky hair blew in a half halo of alarm. The cantina was a mile or two ahead, up a short, dusty road. A canvas sign over the awning had been turned on its side by the wind. They parked under the one tree in the dirt lot. Ben banged on the empty counter. "Cerveza!" he shouted. "Cerveza for a thirsty man!" Pablo was looking at some magazines on a shelf in the corner, flipping the pages looking for something. In a few minutes, a reedy, mustachioed man emerged from the back. He was wearing a clean white apron with a torn pocket, the long ties looping carefully around his waist. He pulled a towel from under the counter and wiped his hands on it. The store was empty. One of his eyes was slightly bloodshot. He went around to the other side of the counter. "Why is Ben yelling?" Gina whispered into Pablo's shoulder. "He's trying to sound American," Pablo laughed. "He thinks it'll impress people." He reached into his pocket for his wallet, gestured aggressively to the men. "6 botellas de litro, por favor, y 3 cartellos de marblos." "8 de este," Ben said. "8, señor, the good stuff." Gina wondered what, besides drinking and smoking, they were going to do at the beach. There was no town there, not even a store. That's what they told her, just the house, alone, the windows glinting on the big horizon. Ben lived there sometimes, by himself, for a month at a time, but he hadn't been there for several months. Pablo warned her that the house would almost certainly be damp and bare, a few mouse droppings in the cupboard, that the windows might be hard to see out of. Earlier that week, at the Christmas party, a cousin of Pablo's had told her that Ben had once been rich. Filthy rich, she said, pronouncing it jokingly as filthy. His American mother had left him some money, a trust fund, but he'd squandered it, invested it in a hotel on a highway that never materialized. A graded, half-built highway that was sprouting grass now, beside a barely built hotel with empty elevator shafts. He was, she gathered, permanently between jobs. He sold the occasional bag of pot and was in an American-style country western band that played in hotels along the waterfront. A permanent hangover, he said, from his days in the States. He lived with his mother for a few years in Arkansas, in a subdivision by the river, and now he said he wanted to go back. To get out of this shithole, he said, for good. But she knew it would not be different for someone like Ben in the States or anywhere else. He was depressed and a hangdog, and he didn't have any money. Besides, Uruguay was not a shithole. Gina felt it as a kind of expansion, like the sky moving over an easeful landscape. It was where Pablo was, and Pablo was as familiar to her as her own thoughts. For more than a year, he had been just an image, words on a screen, a phone, a computer, a face on Skype. They talked far more after they parted than they had before Pablo returned home, sharing an intimacy that would have been impossible if they had been living in the same town. Over time, they had come to inhabit each other's lives, his moods and hers, his friends like ghosts in the background, her mother calling from the kitchen, her Bangladeshi roommate studying behind her in the dorm room. In the months he was still at home, before he'd gone to Montevideo for university, Pablo's boyhead room had been scratched like an etching on her brain, down to the crooked, shaded lamp by his bedside. She'd drawn a diagram of it in her notebook. The room was her shady refuge, her mystery, her chiaroscuro. Though her parents didn't say anything outright, Gina felt and resented their silent condemnation. On the way to the airport, her mother had issued an awkward warning. "I know you're grown," she had said. "I know you're independent, but please don't sleep with him at his parents' house. It's bad manners. And in some cultures," she raised an eyebrow, "it's very bad luck." By bad luck, Gina was sure she had meant pregnancy. Gina waited hours in her room each night for the house to go completely quiet. Then, in her short cotton nightgown, she would sneak down the hallway to his room. She loved how his bed smelled, the way his head looked on the pillow, the entirety of the dark they shared. His hands were different, raspier than she remembered them, like a warm, ultra-fine grade of sandpaper over her skin. 2 nights ago, she had stepped on a floorboard as she padded back to her room at about 4 in the morning. It groaned almost like a person. She froze, still and breathing, as one shaft of streetlight jostled on the floor, a slit of blue beneath the curtains. Now Christmas vacation was almost over. She had to start saving again to come see him. He couldn't save enough on his own, and his parents couldn't send him again, or wouldn't. It was hard to tell. Pablo's parents treated her like an interesting sculpture, like something modern that they knew they should appreciate, but just couldn't quite find the sense of. They cooked her special things to eat, put her in a room with an aged cat and a sewing machine. His father was always around, puttering in the kitchen and smiling up absently from the soccer game. If he knew where she went late at night, he didn't let on. Just smiled gently in the morning and offered her some coffee. He'd retired 6 years ago after a heart attack. And when she arrived, he asked about her brothers and her sisters, her plans, why she wanted to study something as useless as art history. He moved slowly, with a pained deliberation. The mother peered at her out of her large, sad eyes and said nothing. One morning, Gina watched her pull a long blonde hair from the back of the couch and drop it carefully, thoughtfully onto the floor. She was busy in her gynecology office. It was his father who offered them the beach house, who made her feel less uncomfortable. As Gina emerged from the restroom, she saw a man approaching the cantina through the parking lot. Behind him, he dragged a large sack in which something was struggling. The man looked neither young nor old, but as he dragged, he tilted his head to one side in the way that people do when they are straining to hear something. He wore flip-flops and a pair of baggy black dress pants cinched by a snakeskin belt. As he worked to lift the sack up onto the steps, he cursed in frustration. The man in the apron shouted something and pointed angrily toward the side door. A thin green smear showed where the sack had been pulled onto the clean linoleum. Ben stood chuckling on the steps, his arms full of liter beer bottles. Without taking his eyes from the sack, he urged 2 of the bottles on Pablo, who accepted without comment. "Better go," Ben said. "This might get dangerous." At some point, the highway converged onto a 1-lane road. The grass grew shorter, and a flat lagoon appeared, studded with the tucked bodies of motionless birds. The water rippled and pulled against itself in opposing patterns. Here and there, Gina could see a tern taking off, its shadow like a gray reminder over the fields. She slouched with her knees up. She was tired and a little irritable. Half hearing the chatter of the 2 brothers in the front, she wondered if they even remembered she was there. If this was the way they were together year in and year out without her. She closed her eyes and waited for the sleepiness to wash over her, listened for the sound of cars passing in the other direction. They came only at long intervals, with a whoosh and a silence. "You still there?" Pablo asked after a while. "Mm-hmm. You want to go dancing tonight?" "Sure, dancing in the moonlight." She opened her eyes and studied the edge of the road, the ditch. It was that aura just outside a dream, the road story, the road leading her away to somewhere inside herself where everything was light and elusive. She felt suddenly like somebody else. "What was in that sack?" she asked. "What was that guy doing?" "Out here," Pablo said, "it could be anything. I mean, he might have a butcher shop back there. Maybe it's his own little kid. Who knows? These country people are strange." Pablo was the one who spotted it first. Something strange on the horizon, a shadow like a tilted outhouse off to the right. As they got closer, they could see that it was a car, an orange Peugeot, crumpled face first in the ditch. A woman lay curled at the side of the road, clutching her bare leg among some broken glass. Her skirt was around her hips in a magenta pool, just below her knees, her leg bent away at a strange angle. Her face was contorted, her mouth open. The older man in a light blue skirt and khakis paced the roadside, his fingertips pressed to his temples in a caricature of distress. "Pull over," Gina said. "I don't know," Pablo said, slowing down. "Somebody's probably called already." Ben leaned forward. "Hey, I think it's your mom's friend," he said. "You better pull over, man." Pablo had responded in Spanish, speaking rapid fire, too fast for Gina to understand. She thought she could make out clínica and puta, but it could have been something else. "Come on," she said. "Pull over, there's nobody else." "Yeah," said Ben, "we should stop." They were alongside the crash now, crawling along at a few miles per hour. The air outside bloomed dry and gusty. Heat drifted up from the pavement where the driver stood breathing hard, still rubbing his hands through his oiled hair and looking fixedly at his car. Both Pablo and Ben knew him, Dr. Somebody from the clinic where Pablo's mom worked. Ben confided this to Gina in a low tone as his brother went over to shake the man's hand. The woman, he whispered, was not the wife. Gina did not know what her role was. More than anything else, she wanted to muffle the screaming. The sound was high and constant, the keening of a dying animal. She stepped around to where the injured woman lay by herself in the gravel and stopped cautiously over the contorted form, ransacking her memory for useful bits she had learned in the first aid class she had in PE. "Don't move the patient," she thought. "Keep her warm." She breathed quickly. The woman's leg was alarmingly twisted, embedded with broken glass and marred by a long gash above the knee that looked like an open mouth pulsing blood. Just below the cut, a protrusion threatened to erupt below the white skin. Shit, Gina thought, shit. As she made motions for pulling a blanket over her, the woman looked up, quit screaming for a second, and held Gina in a look of hot, unadulterated contempt. Her mouth was pale and full, working as if she were trying to work up a spit. The first few buttons of her blouse had come undone, and Gina could see the red lace of her bra and the bulge of one breast. She was wheezing softly. "Pablo!" Gina sensed a wave of panic approaching. "Get over here, her leg is totally fucked!" Pablo glanced up from where he was talking to the doctor. The wind blew over his eyes. For a moment, he regarded Gina blankly, as if he were nearsighted and wasn't sure she was the one he thought she was. She was who he thought she was. Then he turned to the doctor, who seemed to finally come to himself, to understand that he was being pressed for information. He squinted and raised a sweaty hand in their direction. "It is not a problem," he said in his throaty, accented English. "She will be helped." "When?" she said a little hysterically. "Is an ambulance coming?" Pablo consulted with the doctor briefly, then looked back towards Gina with the same blank expression. "He says he called a tow truck." "Come here, man." Ben pulled Pablo aside, and the two began to argue in their brotherly Spanish. Pablo moved his arms emphatically, as if to dispute a point, while Ben listened with his hands in his pocket, speaking occasionally or shaking his big head. The doctor stood to the side, then took a couple of steps and placed a firm hand on Pablo's shoulder, guiding him away from Ben. They conversed briefly. In a few minutes, Pablo walked over to the Peugeot, forced the driver's door open, and began to remove liquor bottles, filling his arms and finding places for them in the crowded trunk of his own car. There were 5 or 6 bottles, rum or brandy maybe, one half empty. Beyond the shadow of Pablo's little car, Gina could see the road fall away into the distance, ending in a small, vague point at the far end of the V. As Pablo fumbled in the trunk of his car, Gina approached Ben. "Is an ambulance coming?" Ben shrugged. "Maybe. He's worried about how things will look if they take her to the facility where he knows somebody." Gina squinted at him. Did he actually say that? He raised both hands in a gesture of helplessness. Then, after a long pause, do you want a beer? Give me your phone, she said. No. Gina took Ben's phone out of his pocket. I'm calling, she said. What's the number for 911? He laughed quietly. There's no such thing. Then what? She began to type in the words for ambulance, hospital, and the name of the road they were on. The words appeared like scores of musical notes, repeating and unfamiliar. In her haste, she was typing in searches before the results could appear. Ben took the phone from her. In a minute, he handed it back. A number was on the screen. You call, he said. She returned his gaze defiantly, then snatched the phone. Fine, Flaco. Afterward, she walked over and without looking, placed a blanket over the woman. Then they waited. Gina lit a cigar and leaned against the side of the car. The wind from the fields carried the smell of standing water. Off to the side, Pablo and Ben sipped silently on their liter bottles of beer. Each minute seemed to stretch into a flat, hot blur. No one spoke above the high, intermittent screams. After a while, Ben set his bottle on the ground and shuffled across the highway to urinate. Pablo watched until they could just see the top of his head over the edge of the ditch. Sorry about him, Pablo said quietly, pointing to this distraught figure of the doctor. It's my mom's friend, you know. Gina took a deep drag of her cigarette and let the smoke eke from between her lips. Yeah, Ben told me, she said. She reached over and stubbed the cigarette out on the windshield, noting for a moment the distortion of her reflection in the bug-splattered glass. Me encanta. She noted with a little spurt of surprise that the doctor's shirt tail hung out on one side and his belt buckle slouched wantonly, unbuckled. He waited with his hands in his pockets, looking as if he had been punched. Pablo glanced away, then pulled out his phone and pretended to become absorbed in the little screen, rocking slightly from side to side as he texted. The first ambulance came without hurry, a small white spot growing gradually larger. At last it became real, noisy, a rusty white Toyota van manned by two locals wearing shorts and sports jerseys. The driver took his time parking. There were no formalities, no stretcher, no forms to fill out. The driver spoke briefly with Pablo and the doctor before jotting something down on his clipboard. The other attendant remained in the passenger seat, fiddling with the radio. He did not look up when the tow truck pulled up behind him. Gina and Ben stood off to the side like bystanders. She could see that Pablo was uncomfortable, explaining something to the ambulance driver, who was nodding and rubbing his stubbly chin. The doctor continued pacing, rumbling his own hair in shock and bewilderment. He cares more about his car, thought Gina as she watched him. Though only a few feet from the ambulance attendant, he remained focused intently now on the tow truck driver, who was attempting to winch the car up out of the ditch. It emerged at a steep angle, the cable screeching quietly as it pulled. At one point, the sedan veered drunkenly from side to side and seemed about to drop before righting itself and hanging with its crumpled nose gazing the damp, flattened grass at the edge of the ditch. Pablo leaned in and spoke to the ambulance driver, who looked up for confirmation from the doctor before he placed the clipboard back in the car. Then he began to walk toward the screaming form on the roadside. Finally. Gina watched as the ambulance driver approached the woman and squatted to speak to her. His voice was low and gruff as he questioned. He pulled the edge of the blanket to look at her leg. Gina studied their two faces, his unshaven, hers smeared with mascara and clotted with makeup. The woman grimaced and turned her face away, causing his voice to drift to a whisper as he gently, almost absently, brushed her jaw with the back of his fingers. Then, with an intake of breath and a grunt, he hoisted her up with one hairy arm, supporting her with the other as she leaned against him, screaming. Gina felt a grip in her stomach. The woman had been screaming for 45 minutes. Longer than that if you figured the time she had been there before they arrived. The sound of it was like dizziness in her head. She saw the place where the woman had been sick in the dirt, where she tried to cover it up by pushing sand over it. She watched the two of them, the man and the woman, as they made their painful way to the van. Pablo stood behind them, looking lost. Gina took a step forward. ¿Puedo ayudarle? Sí, the driver answered impatiently. La puerta. Then, still struggling against the weight of the injured woman, who seemed to have grown even more pale in the upright position and listed woozily between her screams, he winced and called out to his partner, Miguel! Then louder, Miguelito! Miguel, a tall, red-haired boy of about 14, jumped from the front seat of the van and hurried to slip his arm around the woman from the other side. As the three of them hobbled forward, Gina pulled the handle and slid the rusted side door open with an effort. Inside, she saw a kind of bed made up on the folded down seats, a pad of blankets and a fresh white pillow. It was going to be hard to get her in there, she thought. Again, she asked in her most careful Spanish, ¿Puedo ayudarle? No, señorita, the driver grunted, elbowing her aside. He eased a careful arm under the injured woman's hips, bent his knees, and gave a big heave to get her up on the edge of the makeshift bed. Her leg dangled, an ugly mess of bulges and clotted blood. The woman gasped and tried to steady herself by placing a hand on the metal bracing at the top of the door. Her eyes, staring out through garish black circles, were lit with an intense desolation. After a long, wavering moment, Gina realized the woman was looking directly at her. Cerdos. Her pale lips formed into a hiss. Son cerdos. Then, with a pathetic effort, she gathered all the saliva in her mouth and discharged an inaudible plop beside Gina's right foot. The second ambulance came about 15 minutes later, lights flashing. The doctor, heavy-lidded and eager to leave, sat without moving in the passenger seat of the tow truck. Gina could hear Pablo say to the medic that there had been a mistake, that 2 ambulances had been called and the other ambulance had already come and gone. She suppressed a feeling of her own shame when the medic began to curse. It was she who had called him. It was she who had been unable to relieve the woman's suffering. She watched helplessly as the medic thrust his radio back in his shirt pocket, shook his head, and drove away without responding to Pablo's mumbled apology. It had been a nice new ambulance with letters on the side and flashing lights. By the time they finally arrived at the beach, the sun was just dropping and the sea and sky joined each other in spreading streaks of gray and darker gray. Gina slammed the back car door and headed right for the surf. The sand felt warm and pliable under her feet. If this were the Pacific, she would wish to wade in and be tugged away by it, to feel the water and let it guide her deep away into the wash and graininess. She squinted into the horizon and felt the water warm surge around her calves. Pablo came back to stand beside her, and she said to him in a low voice, without turning her head, "You know I hate you now." For a prolonged minute, he did not answer. Out of the corner of her eyes, she was conscious of his jaw, the curve of which she loved so well, moving slowly back and forth. "That is a strong word," he said at last.